It wasn't the cold of the hospital hallway that stayed with Naomi. It wasn't the antiseptic smell, or the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like something broken that nobody had bothered to fix. What stayed with her, what she would think about, at 2 in the morning, for months afterward, was the moment she looked through the narrow window in the ICU door, and saw her husband standing in the corridor with another woman, and realized he was laughing. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind of laugh that escapes you when you don't know what else to do. It was relaxed, easy, the kind of laugh you share with someone you've been comfortable with for a long time. Naomi Whitfield had been in that bed for 11 hours by then. The car accident had happened on a Wednesday evening. Black ice on the highway outside Ottawa, a truck that couldn't stop in time, and then nothing. She had woken up with a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, and a collapsed lung that the surgeon said had been, in his careful words, a very close thing. She had woken up asking for her husband. Kevin had been there when she first opened her eyes. He'd held her hand, brushed her hair back from her forehead, told her everything was going to be fine. She'd believed him. She had always believed him. Then the visiting hours ended, and then they started again, and by the second day he was harder to reach. He came in the mornings, stayed 40 minutes left for work. He texted sporadically. When she called he answered, but something in his voice had shifted, a flatness she couldn't name. She told herself it was stress. She told herself he was scared and didn't know how to show it. On the 4th day, her younger sister Jade drove up from Kingston and arrived at the hospital in the afternoon. She found Naomi awake, trying to eat the bowl of soup that had gone cold on her tray, and the look on Jade's face when she walked in, that particular arrangement of relief and fury and something else, something careful, told Naomi that her sister already knew something she didn't. "Where's Kevin?" Jade asked, too casually. "He was here this morning. He had a presentation." "Right." Jade set down her bag and pulled the chair close to the bed. "Naomi, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm because your lung is still. Just say it." Jade said it. The woman's name was Renata. She worked in Kevin's office, had worked there for 2 years. Jade had found out through a mutual friend the week before the accident, had been trying to figure out how to tell Naomi, had been carrying it around like a stone in her chest. And then the accident happened, and she'd thought, not now, not while she's in surgery, not while she's unconscious. But now Naomi was awake, and Jade had driven 3 hours to tell her in person, because some things you don't say over the phone. Naomi didn't cry. She lay there with the cold soup in front of her, and felt something drain out of her, slow and quiet, like water leaving a bathtub. She thought about the morning of the accident, how she and Kevin had argued about something small, something she couldn't even remember now, and how he'd left for work without saying goodbye properly. She had felt guilty about that for 4 days. She'd been lying in an ICU bed, feeling guilty for a fight that didn't even matter, while her husband was, while he was. How long? She asked. At least 8 months. Maybe longer. 8 months. She'd had her gallbladder out 6 months ago. It sat beside her in the recovery room, and held a basin while she was sick from the anesthesia. She thought about that now, and something hard and cold settled in the center of her chest. That evening, she saw them. She'd asked the night nurse if she could sit up in the chair for a while. The doctor had said she needed to start moving, and she'd managed to get herself to the window that looked out into the main corridor. Kevin was there, jacket off, leaning against the wall outside the visitor's lounge. He had 2 coffees. Renata was beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her head tilted back with laughter. Naomi stood there on her crutches and watched her husband laugh in a hospital hallway, while she was 60 feet away with a chest tube. She didn't say anything that night. She let Kevin come in, kiss her on the forehead, tell her she was looking better. She watched his face while he talked and tried to find the man she'd married in there somewhere, and she found him, fragments of him, but she also found the shape of all the lies, and once you see that shape, you can't unsee it. She asked him, quietly, as he was putting on his coat to leave. "Is there something you need to tell me?" He said no. She said okay. She waited until he was gone, and then she called Jade and said, "Find me a lawyer." Naomi had been with Kevin for 9 years. They'd met at a conference in Toronto. She was a project manager for a construction firm. He was in commercial real estate. And they'd built a life together, the way you build a house. Slowly, with attention to detail, believing it would last. They had a condo in Centretown, a shared savings account, a dog named Albert who slept at the foot of their bed. They had been talking about buying a house in Westboro. They had been talking about a lot of things. None of that made the conversation easier when Kevin came in the following Saturday morning, and she told him she knew. He didn't deny it. She'd half expected him to, half prepared herself for the exhausting theater of denial. But he sat down in the visitor's chair and rubbed his face with both hands and said, "I was going to tell you. After you were better." "After I was better," she repeated. "I didn't want to. You were laughing, Kevin. 4 days after my surgery, I could see you through the window, and you were standing in the hallway laughing with her." He looked at the floor. "I know how that looks." "I don't think you do," Naomi said. "Because if you did, you wouldn't still be sitting in that chair." He left. She cried for approximately 20 minutes, which was all she had energy for. Then she asked the nurse for more painkillers, and she lay in the dark, and she thought about what came next. What came next was 3 more weeks in the hospital, then 6 weeks of outpatient rehabilitation, then physio 3 times a week, then a slow return to something resembling normal. What came next was Kevin moving into the spare bedroom of the condo, and sleeping there in a terrible polite silence while Naomi healed. What came next was the lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had an office in Glebe and a reputation for being, as Jade put it, allergic to nonsense. "He wants to stay in the condo until the sale goes through," Patricia told her at their first meeting. "He's claiming he needs stability during the process." "The condo is mine," Naomi said. "My parents gave me the down payment, which means we document that clearly." "What else do you have?" Naomi had the texts. She'd found them on the shared tablet they kept in the kitchen. Kevin had forgotten she could access his account, and she'd screenshotted 67 of them, before he realized, and changed his password. She had 8 months of evidence of an affair conducted during her recovery from gallbladder surgery. During a weekend trip, she'd taken to visit her parents in Vancouver while he stayed home for work. And during at least 3 evenings, she specifically remembered because he'd told her he was working late. Patricia looked at the screenshots with the expression of someone who has seen worse, but only just. "This is solid," she said. "We'll use it." What Naomi hadn't been prepared for was Kevin's family. His mother, Diane, called her the week after she was discharged from hospital, and the conversation went in a direction Naomi should have anticipated but didn't. "I know Kevin's made mistakes," Diane said. "But you have to understand the pressure he's been under. His father's health, the market conditions, he's been stretched very thin." Naomi was sitting at her kitchen table with her crutches leaning against the wall and a cup of tea going cold in front of her. "He was laughing, Diane," she said. "In the hospital, while I was in the ICU. There was a pause. Well, there might be more to that than you know." Naomi thanked her for calling. She hung up the phone. She sat there for a long time. Kevin's friends were worse. One of them, a man named Todd, who Naomi had always found slightly unbearable at dinner parties, sent her a text message saying that Kevin was going through something and she should try to have some compassion. She forwarded it to Patricia. Patricia added it to the file under a folder she had labeled, with characteristic efficiency, "Miscellaneous unhelpful." What saved Naomi, and she would say this clearly, later, when people asked, was not anger. Anger was there, but it burned fast and left her exhausted. What saved her was something colder and more purposeful than anger. It was the moment she sat in her living room, 3 weeks after coming home from the hospital, and looked at the life she had built, the condo, the savings, the career she'd spent 15 years building, Albert asleep at her feet, and understood that she was still here. She had nearly died on a highway outside Ottawa, and she was still here, and she was not going to spend whatever came next being defined by what Kevin had done. She called her friend Simone. Simone was an occupational therapist who had known Naomi since university, who had been trying to get Naomi to talk for weeks, and had been carefully not pushing. She came over that evening with takeout from the Thai place on Bank Street, and they sat on the couch with Albert between them, and Naomi told her everything. "What do you want?" Simone asked, when Naomi was done. "I want the condo. I want him gone. I want to stop feeling like I'm underwater." "Okay." Simone pulled her feet up under her. "What else?" Naomi thought about it. "I want to go back to work. I've been off for 2 months and I'm losing my mind." "That's a good start." She went back to work 6 weeks before her physio said she was ready. Her firm had held her position. She'd been managing a major infrastructure project before the accident, and the team had kept things running, but they needed her back. She walked in on crutches and sat down at her desk and felt, for the first time since the accident, like herself. Kevin moved out in March. He took his clothes, his monitor, his coffee machine, and a lamp he'd always claimed was his, but which Naomi was fairly certain she'd bought at a market in Kensington. She didn't argue about the lamp. She let him take it. She stood in the doorway and watched him carry things to his car, and she felt something lift off her shoulders. Not joy exactly, more like the absence of a weight she'd been carrying. So long she'd forgotten it was there. The divorce was straightforward in the way that divorces are never actually straightforward. Kevin's lawyer pushed back on the asset division. Patricia pushed back harder. There were 3 months of back and forth that cost money Naomi resented spending, but in the end, she got the condo. She outgot the savings. Kevin paid a portion of her legal fees because, as Patricia explained with satisfaction, the evidence of misconduct made the judge sympathetic. Renata, as far as Naomi could tell, lasted about 4 months as the main event before fading. Naomi heard this through a former colleague of Kevin's who had remained friendly with her, not because she was looking, but because Ottawa is not a large city and people talk. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd expected. She mostly felt tired. What she felt instead, and this surprised her, was a gradual returning to herself. It happened in small ways. She started running again, first slowly, then with more confidence, her body remembering what it was capable of. She cooked dinner properly instead of standing over the counter eating crackers. She called her parents in Vancouver more. She went to concerts with Simone and stayed out later than she needed to, and came home pleased with herself for no particular reason. She started writing about it, not for anyone else, just notes, at first, on her phone, things she was thinking about at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. About how betrayal doesn't announce itself. About how you can be lying in a hospital bed, wanting your husband and not realize, in that same moment, that wanting him is itself the wound. About how healing from physical injury and healing from what Kevin had done were happening simultaneously, and how she couldn't always tell them apart. The ache in her ribs from the accident, and the ache somewhere deeper, from the things she'd seen through the window. She showed the notes to Simone one evening, expecting Simone to say something encouraging and vague. Instead, Simone read them carefully, scrolled back to the beginning, and said, "Naomi, you have to do something with this." "Like what?" "Like write it, properly, all of it." Naomi laughed. "I manage infrastructure projects. You also almost died and rebuilt your life in 9 months. I think you can do both." She started the blog in April 8 months after the accident. She didn't use her full name at first, just NW, and a header that read, "What I learned from a hospital window." She wrote about the accident and the recovery. She wrote about what she'd seen in the corridor, and what it had meant, and what she'd done about it. She wrote about Patricia and the legal process. She wrote about Albert, who had remained steadfastly on her side throughout, and who she considered, only half-jokingly, to be the most loyal male in her immediate circle. The response was not what she expected. By the end of the first month she had 4,000 readers. By the second month, 12,000. Women wrote to her from across Canada and beyond. From Alberta, from Nova Scotia, from Scotland and New Zealand and a suburb of Chicago. To say that her story was their story, or close enough that it didn't matter. Women who'd been told they were overreacting. Women who'd been in hospital beds wondering why the person they loved most wasn't beside them, and discovering later exactly why. Women who'd done the math on the timeline and found things they didn't want to find. She started using her name. It felt necessary, like a decision, like a small act of refusing to hide. By the end of the year she had signed a contract with a publisher in Toronto for a memoir. The editor, a sharp and cheerful woman named Gwen, called her after reading the proposal and said, "This is going to matter to a lot of people. I want to make sure we do it right." "That's what I want too," Naomi said. She met Thomas at a friend's dinner party in November, 14 months after the accident. He was a structural engineer. She made a joke about their professional overlap that he laughed at, which was a good sign. And he was recently separated, raising a 10-year-old daughter named Lily on alternating weeks. He was careful and quiet in the way that some men are when they've been through something and are still figuring out who they are on the other side of it. She recognized the quality because she had it herself. They talked for 2 hours at that dinner. He didn't ask for her number. He asked if she'd be willing to be connected through their mutual friend, if she was interested in getting coffee. She found this so unexpectedly considerate that she said yes before she'd fully decided. Coffee turned into a walk by the canal. The walk turned into dinner, twice, 3 times. He was honest about his situation, the separation, the daughter, the days when single parenting felt overwhelming, and the days when it felt like exactly the right shape for his life. She was honest about hers. She told him about the accident, about what she'd seen through the window, about the blog and the book. He didn't say the wrong things. This was, she whispered, more unusual than it should have been. Kevin's lawyer sent a letter in February attempting to revisit the asset division on the grounds that a business opportunity had changed Kevin's financial position. Patricia dismissed this with a 3-paragraph response that Naomi read with quiet appreciation. Kevin's appeals grew less frequent after that. His presence in her life reduced to the practical. A shared subscription they hadn't cancelled. A piece of mail that still arrived occasionally at the condo. And then to almost nothing. The memoir came out in September, 18 months after the accident. Naomi called it The Window. The cover was simple, pale blue, a hospital corridor rendered in soft focus. And Gwen had been right that it would matter to people. The first week's sales were beyond what her publisher had projected. She did interviews on CBC Radio, a podcast she'd admired for years. A segment for a morning show that made her feel briefly and absurdly exposed, but which generated more letters to her publisher than anything else. Women stood in line at her book events and told her things they hadn't told anyone else. She stood there and listened and tried to give each of them a full minute of genuine attention, which was the least she could do. She heard through Simone, who had heard through someone else, that Kevin had seen the book. She didn't know what he'd done with that information, and didn't ask. She thought about him less than she expected to. When she did think about him, it was mostly with something that resembled pity, and pity is not the same as pain. What she thought about instead was everything she was building. The blog. Now a newsletter with 40,000 subscribers. The memoir, the talks she was starting to give at women's conferences. Not as an expert in anything formal, but as someone who had been through something, and had useful things to say about it. She thought about the infrastructure project she was still managing, which was going well and which she was proud of. She thought about Albert, who was slowing down a little with age, but remained deeply committed to sleeping in whatever spot was least convenient. She thought about Thomas, who was patient and honest and who had, over 6 months of careful getting to know each other, become someone she trusted. Not blindly, not with the easy uncomplicated trust she'd had before the accident, and before the window and before all of it, but a harder, more deliberate trust, the kind you build after you've learned what the alternative costs. There was a moment, late in the winter of that second year, when Naomi was sitting at her desk working on the follow-up essay her editor had asked for, and she stopped typing, and looked around her office. Her own office now, not a shared space, the condo reorganized since Kevin had left to make room for her own thinking, and she understood something she hadn't quite been able to articulate before. She was not glad the accident happened. She was not glad that she'd spent 3 weeks in a hospital with a collapsed lung and a fractured pelvis. She was not glad Kevin had done what he'd done, but she was here. She was herself, more fully than she'd been in years, maybe more fully than she'd ever been. The accident had broken several bones and rearranged her life, and she had set the bones and rearranged the life better than it had been before, and nobody had done that for her. She had done it herself, with Jade and Simone and Patricia and Gwen and Albert and eventually Thomas beside her, but the doing had been hers. Kevin had stood in a hospital corridor and laughed. He had looked at the window to her room and turned away. She had looked out through that same window and seen what she needed to see, and she had built her entire recovery on that clarity. At the book launch, she had said something that became the line people quoted afterward. The worst moment of my life turned out to be the clearest. I've been trying to see that clearly ever since. She meant it then, she still meant it now. Thomas proposed on a Tuesday evening in April, standing in her kitchen helping her make dinner, not on one knee but just there, solid and present, saying that he wanted to keep showing up if she'd let him, that he knew what she'd been through and he was asking to be part of what came next, and that he would understand if the answer was not yet or not now or not like this. He was wearing an old flannel shirt. Lily's drawings were on the refrigerator behind him. Albert was underfoot, as always, angling for someone to drop a piece of carrot. Naomi looked at all of it, this completely ordinary scene in a kitchen she'd made her own, and said yes.